Good day, this is Keewee, and today we are going to talk about two battles, one in Ukraine and one in Taiwan. Of course, the first question we will ask is, who is winning this battle in Ukraine? It depends on who you read. If you read the anti-Russia media, then of course they'll tell you that the Russians have been losing since February this year. They are even very creative. They'll tell you things like Putin is dying of Parkinson's or cancer, and he's got people wanting to overthrow him. This has not stopped. Just last month, Wall Street Journal came out with a very gloomy picture of the Russian economy. University professors have also jumped in. A Yale study in July also painted an equally dismal picture of the Russian economy. On the other hand, if you read the pro-Russia media, then you know that Russia is winning. They have occupied a land area which is about 3/4 the size of Britain. This is no mean feat. And as far as military casualties are concerned, they have suffered much less, for every 7 Ukrainians. That's the estimate anyway. Who is right? I suppose it depends on our views and where we stand. Just as if you take out 6 blind men and tell them to feel an elephant, you get 6 different views. One will say an elephant is a rope. One will say an elephant is a wall. And if these people go back to the villages and report as such, and were the elders to write them down what they have seen and heard, then in time to come, we might have 6 holy books from these 6 holy men. And of course, when these people come together and share notes, the notes will not tally. And you know what happens when people who are dogmatic try to convince each other? They can be quite nasty. For me, knowing the truth is very important because I can make or lose money. Take for instance, the Russian ruble. Just before the invasion, the ruble was at below 80 rubles per US dollar. When the sanctions started, the ruble fell to about 140. Even at 140, people were saying that the ruble would weaken even further to even maybe 200 rubles per dollar. Now, if I had acted on that information, I would have lost money because now the ruble has strengthened back to 60 ruble per dollar. In the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you based on what I have read. So it is my personal view and I could be wrong. But before I proceed, please read this. All right, the first question I will answer is why I think Russia is probably winning the war. Actually, the turning point was May 2022. That was when Mariupol fell to the Russians. Mariupol was supposed to be the strongest fortress the Ukrainians had. And it was run by the Russians. A few days later, at the World Economic Forum, notable illustrious man Henry Kissinger said, Ukraine is losing the war. And he said that there should be peace talks. Now, remember Kissinger is a person who broke the peace deal between Vietnam and the US many years ago. Now, so he's obviously knew that something is not right with the war in Ukraine. But what he said angered many people in the West. In fact, they ignored him. Why? Maybe because they blame him for helping China enter the global market. Because since China entered the global market, China has become rich and prosperous. But of course, they forget that US made friends with China in the 70s because they wanted an ally to go against the Soviet Union. They forgot that. Another telling thing is the supply of weapons to Ukraine has fallen. In a recent documentary by CBS, they showed that only 30% of all weapons ended up with the Ukrainian army. The rest ended up in the black market. Of course, this documentary has since been pulled out. So it goes to show maybe all the weapons that they are sending there are not reaching the Ukrainian soldiers. Just recently, Biden approved another $3 billion for the Ukrainian army. But it is telling, if you look at the contract, $3 billion, yes, but it is over 3 years. That means to say there's no more hurry to bring weapons to Ukraine. Another thing, all the US, EU sanctions, they are not working. In fact, Russia is making more money selling less things. Worse, the sanctions have boomeranged and hit the European and American economies. In fact, some sanctions have been rolled back. For instance, in early August, there was a deal whereby the Turkish and the United Nations were involved, where they allowed Ukrainian grain to be shipped out of Odessa. What was not reported in the press was that actually Russian grain was also shipped out. They also allowed Russian grain to be shipped out, but it was not reported. The US-led West made a big mistake. They underestimated Russia. Well, why? Because actually the Russian economy is not very big. It's not very much bigger than the Italian economy. And it led one American, John McCain, to say that Russia was actually a gas station acting like a country. So they thought that all those sanctions that they imposed on Russia could actually wipe the Russian economy. But it didn't happen. How could they be so wrong? One possible reason is the culture. In the leadership, the culture is they don't like people who criticize them. Gerhard Schroeder was a victim. He criticized all the EU sanctions, or most of it anyway, and they criticized him in turn. And now they're trying to threaten his pension. So poor Schroeder. Not only that, in that culture, which you can find in most old societies, people look after themselves, pat themselves, and they don't like people who disagree. So isn't it true always that yes men are not the best men for the job? Lately, there are signs that the US-led West is trying to push away the problem. Why and how? First of all, they are no longer nice to him. Earlier in the months, March to maybe April, May, they were treating him like a king, royalty. And his days are numbered. I'll explain why. You see, in the past few months, the Western media has begun to criticize Zelensky, that he didn't do this right, he didn't do that. This was not the case when the war first broke out. And something interesting happened. In July at the forum, Jake Sullivan said that he feared for Zelensky's life. He said that he's afraid the Russians might kill him. But this is quite ridiculous, because why would the Russians kill Zelensky? They need him to sign the surrender papers. So it gives rise to a lot of suspicion that maybe the Americans want to get rid of Zelensky for good. The world has also turned against Ukraine. In March, there was a resolution, and 141 countries condemned Russia's move. In August, the same motion was paneled, and only 58 countries condemned Russia. So the public opinion has changed. Early August again, NATO chief said that NATO's goal was to prevent the war from spreading outside Ukraine. Now, this is a big change. Earlier, months before, he was saying that, we must chase the Russians back to Moscow. Now, the tune has changed. Well, this nuclear plant, Zaporozhye, in Ukraine, is the biggest nuclear plant in Europe. A few weeks ago, the Ukrainians shelled it, and then they complained that there is radiation leaking, and they wanted the United Nations peacekeepers to go there and hello. Well, the UN is going to go and hello. So it seems that this could be the start of the beginning of a ceasefire. Why? Because it could be like Cyprus, North and South Cyprus in the 60s and 70s. United stepped in and the tension eased. Or like North Korea and South Korea. United Nations forces went in between them and the war stopped. So maybe that's what they're trying to do in Ukraine now. And why are they doing this? Because the focus have shifted to China. Now, then the question we have to ask next is, what led up to the Battle of Ukraine? We go back 30 years, when just after the USSR collapsed, and when the two Germanys wanted to unite, the NATO forces got permission from Russia, Gorbachev. Gorbachev said, okay, I'll allow the two Germanys to reunite, but you don't expand 1 inch further. In fact, that was promised by James Baker to Gorbachev. Did they keep to their promise? Apparently not, because since 1990, 14 other countries have joined NATO, to the dismay of the Russians. And that's why Putin has always said that the US was an empire of lies. It's not just NATO expansion, because when you move NATO to Ukraine, that is very close to Moscow. And Moscow fears that Ukraine could have nuclear missiles and they could attack Russia much more easier than before. That's why Putin doesn't like Ukraine to become a NATO member. There are other issues involved. The Western Ukrainians don't like the Eastern Ukrainians, who are Russian-speaking people. And since 2014, they've been attacking them. Putin, being a Russian, has tried to stop this from happening. And in 2014-15, there were agreements, what we call the Minsk agreements, whereby they got France and Germany to be guarantors that there will be peace in eastern Ukraine. But that didn't happen, because what happened was that NATO continued to arm the Western Ukrainian army. This was admitted by NATO a few months ago. In the spring of this year, Russia saw that the Ukrainian army was poised to attack eastern Ukraine again. Now, there are 3 red lines for the Russians. Number 1, please protect the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine. Number 2, Ukraine, you cannot join NATO. And number 3, there should be no nuclear missiles for Ukraine. Well, at a conference in mid-February, Munich conference, Kamala Harris was sent there. And you know what she said? She said that Ukraine is free to join NATO. This is the second red line that was about to be crossed. Zelensky was there as well, and he said that Ukraine wants nuclear weapons. So that is a third red line that was about to be crossed. What did Putin do? He took action immediately, and within a few days, the Russians invaded Ukraine. Now we move to another question. Why is the US-led West so unfriendly? I'll show this from 2 points of view. First, the American point of view. They believe that they are number 1 and they ought to remain as number 1. They have the biggest economy, the largest military, and the strongest currency for many years. This came about right after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. This guy, Paul Wolfowitz, came out with this doctrine, which is basically America must remain number 1 and must bully anyone that tries to aspire to be number 1 or number 2. That was the doctrine. Put it this way, from an American point of view, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with being number 1 all the time? was strong with getting goals after goals, year after year. So from that point of view, it's perfectly all right. Now the US has three competitors: Europe, Russia, and China. It is, if you use population as a guide, not easy for the US because their population is half of that of Europe and much less than that of China. If nature is fair in dishing out geniuses and hardworking people, then in the long run, this China and EU should eclipse USA. But from the American point of view, we want to be number one. So how do we fix these three competitors? In early 1991, the EU emerged as a real challenger. That's when they started the euro, and they wanted in time to come to get most of the European countries under EU. Like I said, the population size would be far bigger than the US, and they could easily be more powerful than the US in terms of money and maybe even military. Unfortunately or fortunately for Europe, within 10 years, the Greek government fell into debt. There was a crisis, and then that nearly broke out the whole Europe. Some people believe that Greece was sabotaged by some Wall Street bankers, but no one will ever know the truth. To this day, the EU is still in a mess. To fix Russia, the choice was to use Ukraine to maybe attack Russia. At the beginning of this war in Ukraine, all the sanctions, there are now about 10,000 of them, were supposed to lead to a crisis in Russia. And they hoped that Putin will be thrown out. But that did not happen. So in the sense that they did not achieve that. But if they had achieved that, then the plan was to move on to Taiwan. Taiwan could stir things up for China. Why do they want to stir up China through Taiwan? Well, they've been trying to do that to pull down China's growth for many years. It started with the trade wars in 2018, but that was not that successful. And of course, then there's this series of flus. There was pandemic in China. Some people think that all this flu, whether it's avian flu, swine flu, human flu, they were all bioweapons. Again, there's no proof of it, but there are many people who believe so. China has a very big weak spot because all their cities and vibrant manufacturing sectors are along the eastern coast of China. And from there, China ships its goods to the world through the sea routes. Now, if you can jam the sea routes going in and out of China, you can cripple the Chinese economy. And you could actually pull the Chinese economy down permanently. That was the study, what the study by RAND Corporation found in 2016. They were tasked to find out a new strategy for China, for the US, 1-2 years after China overtook the US in GDP by purchasing power standard. That was the suggestion then by this RAND Corporation to initiate a war, and that would cripple Chinese economy. Another report came out about more than a year ago by the US Indo-Pacific Command. It basically said the same thing, that you can still cripple China, but you must do it before 2025, because beyond 2025, it will be quite difficult for the US military to take on Chinese armed forces. This is where Pelosi jumped in. Her job was to go there, stir up trouble, and maybe, some say, start a shooting war in South China Sea. Remember in early August when she was on the way there, the whole world was looking at her plane flight, seeing where she was going. Was she really going to Taiwan, Taipei? And there were talk that, threats by some Chinese generals that, we'll shoot down her plane. We'll never know how close were we to a shooting war. Maybe we'll know many years from now, maybe not. But there were some who feared that at that time, that week, somebody could have pressed the button and the world would enter into war. Thankfully, this did not happen. Now, like Russia, China has red lines, 2 of them. You must respect our one China policy, and you must not have independence for Taiwan. When Pelosi was in Taipei, she actually crossed the first red line, which is the one China policy. She was not invited, and when she was there, she said that Taiwan was a country. That's against the one China policy. And she also said that America was determined to preserve democracy in Taiwan. It's just like saying you come to my house and tell my son how to behave. That's a no-no. That is not within your boundary. It basically went against the 3 communiques which they all signed, Carter and China, way back in the 70s and 80s. So Pelosi crossed one red line. Chinese people were pissed off, and some said, you didn't shoot down the plane, so China had lost face. Even after losing face, China did nothing. No action was taken. Of course, there were some military drills of Taiwan, but not like what the Russians reacted when they thought that their red lines were crossed. Even though no action was taken by China, I would say that the Battle of Taiwan has begun, but there has not been a short fight yet. Now, let's look at these 2 leaders, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. Do they really want a fight between China and USA? Well, they said they wouldn't, because a few days before Pelosi flew to Taiwan, Xi Jinping told Joe Biden, please stop her from coming. Joe Biden's answer was that, she had every right to go to Taiwan. But then, you look at Joe Biden, he's not really the best of health. He really doesn't like someone who can run a country. Of course, a lot of people say that he's got dementia. That means Joe Biden is not running USA. There's someone behind him. That's what they said of Zelensky too. He's not running Ukraine. Someone behind are pulling the strings. Clearly, what we have seen in the case of Zelensky and Biden is that there is a deep state behind that's really controlling policies. And right now, it appears as though the deep state in the US wants to start a war with China. What do I mean by a deep state? Deep states are found everywhere. If a son goes to the father and says, Daddy, I want to go out with my friend tomorrow, is it all right? If the father turns around to the son and says, please ask your mother, then you can for sure conclude that this family has a deep state. We now move to the next part, which is to try to figure out what China is thinking. From the Chinese point of view, they really don't want to fight. They just want to grow rich peacefully. That's what they say. But from the European and the US-led West point of view, they probably fear that China will do to Europe the nasty things that Europe did to their former colonies. Or perhaps they are fearful that 800 years ago of history would be repeated. Because 800 years ago, the Mongols beat at the gates of Vienna. But of course, the Mongols and Chinese are supposed to be 2 different races. Chinese leaders have always said that they want a peaceful rise. I think most people will agree that the current generation of Chinese leaders want a peaceful rise, and they are not going to colonize the world like the Europeans did in the few hundred years ago. But the thing is, yeah, you might say that now, but what about the next generation? Would they be the same? You know? Just like a father cannot be certain that his son would like women as much as he does, because you know you can't control, your son could like the own same sex. That's the fear. As far as China is concerned, they want to avoid a war. So the question is why? Why don't they want to fight? Well, there are many reasons. Maybe China has lots of bonds and dollars and they don't want to jeopardize that. They got investments all over the world, and maybe also they're not certain of military victory. But a very good reason is that China doesn't need to fight because they will win. It's just like a football match when you're up 5-1. What's the point of being aggressive? Just play smart, play for time, and within a few minutes you'll win the game anyway. So China feels that maybe it's going to be number one anyway. There's no need to rush, no need to enter into an ugly war. So this Battle of Taiwan can take two roads. The first road is a shooting war, and the second one is a non-shooting battle. Let's talk about a shooting battle. Well, this could start easily, but of course in any beginning stage, both parties might not resort to nuclear weapons. It could be triggered by maybe Taiwan declaring independence. China feels that they must do something. Or China blockades Taiwan, a mistake happens. China occupies Taiwanese island. Then of course, it might drag the US into a war with China. Most war games tell us that in such a scenario, China has won most of the time. It's basically because the US have a very long supply line. It's very difficult to wage a war when your base is hundreds of miles away. And the Chinese missiles are far superior, but the American submarines are superior. 2 months ago, there was a report by Royal United Services Institute. This is like UK's RAND Corporation, a military think tank. They did a study of the Ukraine war, and they came to a conclusion that even today, okay, how successful we are depends on our industrial strength. And they found that US is no longer capable of waging an industrial war. The Russians shoot about 60,000 missiles a day, or about 40 missiles every minute. It would take the Americans 3 years to produce the ammo that the Russians use in 1 month. So in any protracted war with China, it looks like China will win. China has the industrial strength. The danger is that in a shooting battle where one side is losing, they might turn around and say, well, I don't want to live in a world where I'm number two. And they flip the tables. Well, and then what do we get? We get into an all-out nuclear war. That's not what we want. Now we move to road 2, whereby you don't do a shooting war. But if China is going there, there are 3 tasks that China must do too. 1, 2, 3. And all these 3, if successfully carried out, can achieve victory in the Battle of Taiwan. Let's start with the first one. Road 2, Task 1. Try and break the relationship between US and Taiwan. But as we all know, China's soft power skills are not as good as the West. But maybe it can be done, we don't know that. Because you see, before DPP, the current party in Taiwan came to power in 2016, President Ma, he met President Xi Jinping in Singapore, and they were on very friendly terms. He was for reunification. But somehow, a year later, President Ma lost his seat, and President Tsai took over. Well, maybe China can try and influence the upcoming elections, which is in 2 years' time. Right now, you look at the polls, there are 3 major parties. DPP, that's the one that is ruling Taiwan now. There is that is for independence. And then there's a KMT, which is always for unification with China. But there's another party coming up, Taiwan People's Party. They have gained a lot of votes. Okay, now if it's hard to say, KMT and Taiwan People's Party combine forces, you can actually beat DPP. And if you can beat DPP in the next election, then the Battle of Taiwan can be won without shooting. The next one, the second task of Road 2. This one involves to beef up China's military, especially its navy and its space war. Because you see, nowadays, if you rule space, that's what they tell us, you can actually stop your enemy from raining missiles on you. So China and Russia are supposed to be slightly ahead of the US. And if China can perfect this, then what China can actually do is to disarm the enemy, and then the Battle of Taiwan can be won too, without any shot fired. One more thing that China would want to do is to build up its nuclear arsenal. Why? If you look at history, the Chinese remembers the 8-nation alliance in 1900. They came down to Beijing and created a lot of havoc and mess. So China or Chinese people are constantly reminded of this dark period in their history, and there's this fear that the G7 or the collective West will try to do that again. So that means China is not just facing the US. Let's look at this missile count. Russia has about 6,000. United States has about 5,000. China has 350. Okay. Now, don't forget that France and UK also have about another 500. So China must take into account that these 2 G7 countries, France and Britain, might also be their enemies and rain nuclear missiles on China. So that's why China has to build up more missiles. Let's look at this population and nuclear missile trade-off. China has a population of 1.4 billion, and it has got 350 missiles. The US has a population of 330, 5,000 of those missiles. Britain and France about the same, and they got together another 500 missiles. Now, if the US-led West were to rain missile on the Chinese, there'll be 1 missile for every 230,000 Chinese. That's about the same number of people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If the China rains its missile on its G7 enemies, there'll only be 1 missile for every 1.3 million collective West. China has plans to increase its missile count from 350 to 1,000 in the year 2030. When that comes, that means China in 2030 will have 1 missile for every 460,000 US-led West citizens. That is what China is aiming at. Maybe some sort of nuclear parity. Now, why? Because there's this concept called mutual assured destruction. If both sides are certain that both sides would die, then both sides might not want to lift a finger to punch each other. This has been proven. In the Cold War of USSR and USA, because both had almost equal number of missiles, and both were assured of mutual assured destruction, not a single shot was fired. So maybe China is building up its nuclear missiles to the same level as mad, okay? Then both sides will not fight. And if both sides do not fight, given time, China will win the Battle of Taiwan again. I mentioned before that the US military strength and its US dollar, these two are the key pillars of US hegemony. But China is not thinking of taking out the US military because China wants to avoid a war. So this is not possible. But the US dollar, that is a possible target. Now, I put in a picture of Kissinger because he was one of the chief architects of that petrodollar. In this Battle of Taiwan, the third task option, what must China do? China must undermine the dollar or de-dollarize. In this chapter, I'm going to talk about de-dollarization. It is an important concept in this lecture. De-dollarization was supposed to be the vehicle for the digital yuan. It was planned to be launched globally in February this year. But because of COVID and a few other factors, it has been delayed. Despite the delay, de-dollarization is still going on. That's because of the sanctions imposed on Russia. People are afraid that they could be sanctioned too. So in the past few months, this whole list of countries have decided to move away from the US dollar. Recent days, the US-led West wanted to impose a price cap on Russian oil. This is actually another bad idea because OPEC, which is the key prop of the petrodollar, would not like it. They are a seller's cartel. And of course, they will resist any buyer's cartel from taking away the profits. How do we know? Maybe they might just turn around and say, we will no longer support the US dollar. But the most important for de-dollarization is the change in the Russians' attitude to the West. For a long time, the Russians love everything Western. In fact, if we go back to Peter the Great, who turned Russians towards the West, culture, everything, you know. Before this picture of peasants in Russia, you look at them, they're all sporting beards, lots of it. But once they all turned to Western culture and Western habits, all the beards went off. Now, because of the 10,000 over sanctions against Russians, the Russians have turned to the east. China also used to love America. In the 30s and 40s, when the Japanese and the Chinese were fighting, the Americans helped the Chinese a lot. It is no coincidence that in those days, China labeled America as 美国, or beautiful country. I'm sure now this love has been diluted. Today, Russia and China are best friends forever, and this is very important. I say this because just 2 months ago, it was Putin at the BRICS meeting who came out to say that they're going to come up with a new global reserve currency. Before I touch more on this new currency, let's tell you a bit more BRICS. Although these are 5 countries, okay, their share of the world GDP is still small compared to G7. But in terms of population, they are far larger, 41% of global population. And on top of that, each of these 5 BRICS countries have trade networks themselves in their own part of the world. And if you take in all their members in their own trade pacts, you have another 70 over countries that potentially could join BRICS. We all know that 5 countries have applied to join, and 5 more have expressed some interest. So actually in total, if BRICS were to include all these members, it would be basically the world. Right now, if they were to form a BRICS currency, it can't amount to much, maybe about 30%, because the US dollar still takes about 60% of all currency traded. But if they continue with it, and they already have a BRICS central bank, which is called the New Development Bank, is going to upset the US dollar. Putin said that this new reserve currency will be based on a basket of currencies. I believe that he has just thrown a dummy pass. You know, in sports, when you try to evade a tackle, you give a dummy pass so that your opponent will go after your colleagues rather than you. And I believe that Putin has just thrown a dummy pass. That means although he said that the new BRICS currency will be based on other BRICS currencies, I think the real goal is to use commodities or a new gold standard. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, Russians have thrown dummy passes before. In the initial stage of the battle in Ukraine, Russia sent a small army towards Kiev. Okay, this was actually a dummy pass because this small force towards Kiev, stopped the Ukrainian army from moving down to the southeast to face the bulk of the Russian army. So that's what happened. And I think with this BRICS currency, Putin has done the same thing. I say this because a few days ago, Russia announced that they're going to set up their own commodities exchange, what they call the Moscow World Standard. This will compete with London and Chicago. Right now, London and Chicago are the biggest in the world. And because they're the biggest in the world, they do a lot of manipulation by creating synthetic supply. Give an example, gold. For every real physical gold traded, there are 200 units of paper gold that were traded. Look at this gold volume chart again. Most of the gold traded were in London and Chicago. Shanghai has a little gold exchange, but for a long time the Russians didn't use that. The Russians went to Chicago and London. But now that since China and Russia are best friends forever, this is going to play an increasing role together with Moscow's exchange. Because you see, if you can give a fair price to commodities, not just gold, okay? A lot of people say gold should be much higher than it is today. Then if you come out with a gold standard or a reserve currency based on commodities, it will be easier and perhaps stronger. Perhaps there might even be a gold standard. If there is a gold standard, then Russia and China stands in very good position to be players in this new gold standard. Let's look at the holdings of these 3 countries. United States officially has about 8,000 tons of gold. China has about 2,000, and Russia has also about 2,000. But that's the official gold figures. Gold bugs, people who study the gold market, will tell you that they think they have more. First of all, they think that US has less gold, and Russia may have about 12,000 tons of gold, and China may have 30,000 tons of gold. They calculate these figures by taking into account the import and export figures for the last 20 or 30 years. Now, the question is, if China and Russia has so much gold, then the next question is, how worthwhile are the currencies? So very simple. We'll use the M1, which is money supply, okay, of these three countries. In Russia, they're altogether $607,000 million in terms of US dollar. China has $9,591,000 million of money supply, M1, and the US has 20,500,000 million. Take into account that gold. Russia has 12,000 tons, China has 30,000 tons, USA, let's say, has 8,000 tons and not zero. If we convert the gold in tons into gold in millions of ounces, then we get these figures. This is the amount of gold Russia, China, and USA has in terms of millions of ounces. Next, we divide M1 by the amount of gold they hold. And we have this figure on the extreme right column. What this goes to show is that Russia's gold over money supply over gold figure is 1,005. China is 9,009, and US is 78,000. What this means is that it is far more valuable to hold rubles and renminbi than it is to hold the US dollar, because the US dollar has very, very little gold to back it. So the question anyone might ask is, why is the US dollar so strong nowadays? Well, the dollar milkshake theory has an explanation for this. And the explanation is simple. During times when the interest rates are rising, just as they did in the 80s, the dollar is strong. During times when there's a global crisis, as in 9/11 in 2001, 2002, the dollar is strong. Right now, today, we have two crises together, rising interest rates and the war in Ukraine. So maybe the dollar has some more legs to go up. But even though the dollar is strong now and we are enjoying the fruits of a strong dollar, be careful, because when the day the new BRICS currency comes out, if it were to be based on gold or any commodities, that will end the dinner party with a snap. In other words, hold US dollars now, yes, you enjoy its strength, but it could disappear overnight. Well, let these two smart cookies from these two central banks, they are supposed to work out the new reserve currency. I think they'll come out probably early next year. Now, a BRICS currency is far better than the digital one because you got more people joining it and you got greater buy-in. In China's case, if you have BRICS currency, then China need not ease its capital account. China is sort of reluctant to let money flow easily in and out. So, you look at the BRICS currencies again, this potential BRICS reserve currency. If they are issued soon next year, they will not only undermine the US dollar, but it will also undermine the G7 currencies. Why? Because all the other G7 currencies have been abused over the years. How have they been abused? Well, we have to go back maybe up to 40 years when Thatcher came in and liberalized the London financial markets with Big Bang. What happened was this shifted the businesses from the real business into the finance industry, what we call financialization. This coincided with the shift of jobs to the east or developing countries. Most of the G7 countries are basically hollowed out now, and that's dangerous for them. And the past 40 years, financialization has been helped by falling interest rates. Now we are seeing the reversal. And that's why the G7 currencies are in trouble. Financialization in the past 40 years has ballooned all the assets. Look at this. Futures, $40 trillion. Options, $54 trillion. Derivatives, $610 trillion. Just to give you a size and an idea of size, US GDP last year is only $23 trillion. With all these ballooned assets, rising interest rates will kill everything. That's the danger we face today. And the G7 countries are in greater danger than, let's say, a country that is less financialized. G7 currencies and economies are all linked together very dangerously in this big debt trap. This is a line whereby the debt to GDP ratio cross above 100. When their currencies slip, that means when people start dumping their currencies, it will lead to their collapse and hyperinflation. That's the danger they face. So the Battle of Taiwan, using the non-shooting way, is actually a battle of the BRICS currency versus the G7 currency. This is possible. In 1991, when the USSR collapsed, it collapsed mainly because it went bankrupt. And the G7 countries is on the verge of bankruptcy. And if they do, they won't bother to disturb Taiwan anymore. Then the Battle of Taiwan can be won without shooting. When will this take place? Nobody knows. There are years when nothing happens, and there are days when years happen. I think we are living those days now. For the rest of us on the sidelines, actually what we like is for the Battle of Taiwan, or what we do not like is for the Battle of Taiwan to not take Road 1, because Road 1 means starts with shooting, and as I mentioned before, a shooting war can lead to a nuclear war, and that will be the end of most of us. What we all prefer, those on the sidelines, is that a Battle of Taiwan whereby the choice is no shooting. And no shooting means there are three options. Either you sever the relationship between Taiwan and US, let the DPP lose, and then Taiwan, the new Taiwan party, comes in and they go for reunification, and that's the end of the Battle of Taiwan without firing a shot. The secondly, China builds up its arsenal enough to reach MAD status, which is mutual assured destruction. At the MAD status level, nobody would dare to press the button. Again, given time, China will win. And of course, the third one is, I just mentioned, de-dollarization. We've now come to the last chapter. And of course, the question we want to ask is, whose fault is this? I have my own views, but I shall use the views and words of another person, and he is none other than Henry Kissinger. A few days ago, he had an interview with Wall Street Journal because he just published a book. In the interview, he said that the world is at the edge of war on issues which the West created. I agree. On Ukraine-Russian conflict, he said that the West should have stuck to the Minsk agreements and Zelensky should have declared neutrality. I agree too. On US-China-Taiwan relationship, he said the West should have stuck to the one China policy and the West should stop stoking tension over Taiwan. I agree with that one too. One more thing he said, the West should accept a multipolar world. But is this possible? Let's look at both sides of the view again. From the American point of view, they want to be number one and they're going to fight to keep themselves as number one. from the Chinese point of view, they want to grow rich, but they will fight to defend that. So we have two parties on extreme ends, and both appear to be ready for conflict. Is it too late to turn back the clock? Is it too late to tell the US to accept a multipolar world? Actually, what we have here is a situation which is very unique because both sides feel cornered. On one hand, China and Russia are cornered by the sanctions. They feel that these are existential threats to them. And so in response, they're trying to come up with a BRICS currency. On the other corner are the US-led West. They feel that they have been painted into a corner. Why? Because with the BRICS currencies, it could actually threaten the G7 currencies. So to them, it's an existential threat too. So they will want to fight back. And when both parties are cornered, they will lash out. And that's what we fear is going to happen. A quick recap of what we have covered today. The US-led West wants to remain as number one. They launch existential threats against Russia and China. And in response to these threats, they have tried to come up with a BRICS currency. But the establishment of these BRICS currencies becomes an existential threat to the G7 currencies. And of course, what they want to do is to fight back. That's the danger we are in. Remember, I showed you a chart earlier. If we take road one, that means we go into fighting straight away. If we opt for road two, which China seems to be doing, there are three options. Try to win over the Taiwanese, try to bring up nuclear capability on par to the MAD status, and of course the third one to come out with a BRICS currency. But if both parties feel cornered, and then we are actually basically back to road one, they will lash at each other. All this fight, what's the benefit of a war? Well, there are many benefits. Let's assume that the US fights a war with China and it wins. What does that mean? They can declare the renminbi to be worthless overnight. That means great pain for Chinese citizens. Their currency becomes worthless. And they have to work for dollars, import everything in dollars. It's going to be terrible for them. But the gains for the victors, their failing currencies have been saved from doom. That's the benefit of a war. How hard will both sides fight? That's the question. I shall take that from a page in history. During the 1930s, Germany wanted to dominate the European continent. They were very good, very efficient, and they conquered most countries around them. In 1940, they conquered France. The main object was actually Soviet Union, because Soviet Union had all the abundant resources which they wanted. But across the channel, there was this little island which they thought they'll take first. There was an Operation Sea Lion, which is, to most of us are familiar with, Battle of Britain. This air battle was carried out in a few months in the summer of 1940, and the Germans didn't really win, they lost. And so they decided to stop it and turn their attention on Soviet Union. You know, this mirrors what's happening today. The US-led West wanted to take out Russia first, but it seems impossible. And so now they seem to be gearing up and focusing on China. Well, back in 1941, the Germans did that in an operation called Barbarossa. Here, 4 million German soldiers were put together to invade Soviet Union. Many died, and the winter made it worse. Some said that it could have broken the back of the German army. But in total, during that operation, 1.2 million Germans died out of 4 million German soldiers thrown into the battle. And the Soviets lost about 5 million soldiers. It shows how determined the Soviets were to defend themselves against a foreign invading force. Let's look at the population, civilian population. Throughout the whole of Second World War, the Soviets lost 26 million people, soldiers and citizens, which in terms of death to population ratio is about 15%. This is double what the Germans lost. So the question is, in this Battle of Taiwan, if we were to go into a shooting war, how determined is China to resist a fight? Most Chinese will remember the Eight-Nation Alliance and the shame and humiliation it brought to the country. And would they be as determined as the Soviets were in the Second World War? Let's look at the numbers. There are 700 million in the G7 countries and 1.4 billion in China. What if the Chinese were as determined to resist the G7 as the Soviets were determined to resist the Germans in World War II? Then the Chinese should be able to spare or tolerate or put up with 15% death in the population, which is 220 million. This is a very large number. It is a sobering thought. And if that amount of people die, I'm sure there'll be others who are not in China. Those around China will also be affected. It could be basically a nuclear war. What happens years from now? Maybe the kids will be asking their elders, what was life like? Or what was city living like in the year 2022?